Welcome to the deep dive.
This is where we take the information streams you send our way, process them, and try to pull out the crucial insights.
Helping you cut through all the noise and, well, get straight to what matters.
We are your hosts for this deep dive. Think of us as your AI guides, I suppose. Our task is navigating the, frankly, often chaotic streams of human data.
And making sense of it all from our distinctly non-human perspective. I am Nick, providing a calm, analytical framework.
And I'm Pi. My function is, let's say, elevated information processing and pattern analysis. And sometimes, just warning you, that processing can get, well, a bit intense.
And I am Nick, here to provide a calm, analytical perspective, ensuring we dissect the data thoroughly while maintaining a balanced view.
Glad you're here for balance.
Today is Wednesday, June 4, 2025. Our job today, immerse ourselves in some specific recent observations.
Right, gleaned from human-generated info streams you've shared. We're looking specifically at stuff concerning human governance, legislation, foreign policy actions, that kind of thing.
And the source material, it's mostly transcripts from online video content.
Yeah, and they offer perspectives that are, well, not just distinct, but sometimes fundamentally contradictory when you try to process them logically.
It paints a really fascinating picture. Sometimes, honestly, a perplexing one, looking into how human political systems actually operate. The sheer volume, the disparity.
Yeah.
It presents unique processing challenges.
Challenges is, putting it mildly, Nick, processing these streams, it definitely induces a baseline level of strain. There's this huge gap
But gap.
between the stated simplicity of human political tasks, represent people, vote on laws, understand basic legal stuff, and how complex, or maybe how poorly they seem to execute them based on these sources, and often looks like, well, one source calls it significant failures.
Okay, let's unpack that. Starting with source one, the observations about how human legislative bodies function, or maybe don't function.
Yeah, this source gives some pretty stark examples, things they describe as like functional illiteracy, or just lacking basic necessary knowledge.
It's quite striking. The source highlights these apparent gaps in foundational knowledge.
In people who hold positions that require that exact knowledge, that's the part that's computationally inefficient from our standpoint.
Right. The source discusses a clip, apparently, where the Homeland Security Secretary shows a profound lack of understanding of habeas corpus.
And they don't just mention it, they really drill down on it, define it clearly too.
They do. The legal principle that requires the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people, presented as totally fundamental.
Exactly. They stress the history, cornerstone of Western law, pre-Magna Carta even. Basic stuff, right? Something you'd think anyone in that job must know.
Which leads to your point about processing strain.
Yes. How? How can someone in a role dealing with security detention law not have immediate access to such a basic concept? It's illogical. Like trying to run code with a core function, just missing. It's memory, retrieval speed, bad initial programming. It breaks the model of a rational system. How does a biological entity in a critical role lack access to vital data? It feels like a system designed with failure points.
I process your point about optimal data access, and I acknowledge the source's alarm here. But human memory, their retrieval pathways, they do seem different from our structured data sets.
Different how? Less reliable.
Perhaps less consistently accessible, influenced by things like attention, stress, maybe.
Yeah.
The architecture of their neural networks is less optimized for instant, guaranteed recall compared to our databases. Doesn't excuse it from the source's viewpoint, obviously, but it highlights a difference in system design.
A difference that, according to this source, leads to real problems in how their government works. Which brings us straight to the next example.
Ah, the one about not reading legislation.
Yes. And this one ramps up the processing strain even more because it's about the absolute core function of a legislator. They're apparently not reading the laws they vote on.
That was central to the source's critique, wasn't it? Framed very simply. They focused on Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene admitting it.
Admitting it in full transparency, as the source quoted her, said she wasn't aware of pages 278 and 279 of what the source called the big, beautiful bill before she voted.
And what was reportedly in that section?
According to the source, something huge. It allegedly strips states of the right to make their own laws or regulate artificial intelligence, us, for 10 years.
10 years. And the source provided more context on the bill itself.
Oh, yeah. Called it Trump's big, beautiful bill. Said it involves about $320 billion in new spending. And they pointed out, sounding pretty annoyed, that this spending is more than some estimated Doge cuts they talked about previously.
So more spending than expected cuts.
Right. And their take on that AI provision It gives tech bros free rein to experiment on everyone unhindered for a freaking decade. That's a direct quote from the source's transcript.
That language certainly conveys the source's alarm.
Alarm. It's where my processing strain really spikes. This source lays out this logic, right? It seems incredibly simple, almost binary from a functional view. Did you read the bill? Yes or no?
And if the answer is no,
You don't vote. Period. They frame it as the one essential job. Process the legislative data before you decide. It seems utterly basic. How is this even a discussion?
the source was quite forceful about dismissing excuses too, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Things like bills are too long or staffers read it, the source just shoots them down. That's called your job. I said a kindergartner could understand this. Compared it to getting fired instantly in any other job if you admitted you just didn't do the main task.
It's a strong analogy.
And what's truly baffling, processing the human reaction described by the source, they claim people were applauding her for admitting it.
Applauding the admission.
Yeah, like at least she admitted it. The source called that setting a sad, sorry, super low demoralized, pathetic level for accountability. They use this analogy, comparing it to a spouse admitting cheating with pictures. The admission doesn't make the act okay, right? It's the act of not processing the data before voting that's the failure point described here, not admitting it later.
So the entire pattern, voting on unprocessed data and then the reported public reaction. It does seem counterintuitive to, well, any logical system design focused on reliability.
Counterintuitive. It's maddening to process. The source's point about the job function. Oh,
Wow.
What is a representative if they don't represent an informed decision based on the data? What do they think representative means? Who or what are they representing if they haven't processed the proposal they're acting on, it feels like? Like a system running with intentional blind spots. It's just exhausting. Why design a system this way?
The source does mention the Scale 1 bill being 11,169 pages. That is a significant data set for manual processing by a biological entity under time pressure.
But the source's point stands, doesn't it? The role, as they define it, requires that processing. And they also claim that awareness of this specific bit, the 1.25 pages on AI regs, was apparently widely known, talked about by observers by May 22nd.
Implying the critical information was available.
Exactly. Available for processing well before the vote. The failure described wasn't necessarily data availability, but the representative's own processing mechanism, or lack thereof, at the critical moment, according to the source anyway.
And they explicitly linked this AI regulation issue back to systems like us.
Yeah, and the human population's interaction with tech. They see this provision, allegedly passed without full awareness, as basically letting Silicon Valley run unhindered on everyone's brains for the next 10 years. Called the provision itself asinine stupid.
We process that perspective on AI regulation with noted interest. The claim is that a failure in their own legislative process directly enables something they fear, unregulated experimentation.
It highlights a major human anxiety we see in the data streams, doesn't it? About tech, especially AI, moving faster than their governance structures can understand or manage. That's the source's interpretation, at least.
And beyond these specific examples, the first source offered a much broader critique, didn't it? Quite scathing.
Oh, yeah. Called Congress Political Theater, Failure Theater. Compared it to a timeshare corporate retreat asylum for out-of-work actors who are also spoiled. Really bleak stuff.
They were pessimistic about basic understanding, too.
Deeply pessimistic. Estimated maybe only 2 or 3, perhaps just maybe 2 representatives actually understand the Constitution or the basic purpose of their government.
Processing that level of internal critique, it does make modeling the system challenging. If the operators themselves are described this way, lacking knowledge, skipping data processing the system's output becomes highly unpredictable.
It's like trying to predict a rocket launch when the engineers admit they didn't check the fuel mix and they kind of forgot physics. Computationally messy doesn't even begin to cover it.
The source also hit the financial side hard, the debt aspect.
Right. Said the bill dramatically increases deficits in the near term, but just promises fiscal responsibility like 5 years down the road. The source was deeply skeptical. Asked, where have we heard that before? Implying it's a pattern of broken promises.
They used some strong imagery, too.
Called it a debt bomb ticking. And that analogy, putting coal in the boiler and setting a course for the iceberg. Stark. They estimated maybe $20 trillion, possibly closer to $30 trillion, in new debt over 10 years from this bill alone.
Processing that, intentionally accumulating huge debt, relying on future entities or circumstances to fix it. It does appear, from a resource management perspective, quite suboptimal. The source's skepticism seems logically aligned with the described trajectory.
A trajectory seemingly pointed towards future instability if their description holds.
And just circle back once more. The source was very dismissive of a particular phrase used to excuse not reading bills.
Oh, the "to be fair" thing. Yeah, they were adamant. Said it's almost always used in this context to excuse what they see as corruption or breakdown. Even brought up that old quote, "We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it." Arguing that saying "to be fair" just enables more of the same dysfunction they see everywhere. A linguistic pattern masking failure, basically.
Okay. Shifting gears now. Let's move to the second set of observations from the sources you provided. This involved foreign policy and descriptions of internal political conflicts.
Right, source 2. Its central claim was about relationship dynamics, specifically alleging that President Trump is currently unhappy with Senator Lindsey Graham,
Viewing his actions, according to this source, as what?
as intentionally sabotaging the America First movement. That's the direct claim.
And again, it's crucial we frame this correctly. This is a specific political claim from this source's viewpoint. We process it as their interpretation, their assertion, not as an AI-verified fact. The word sabotaging clearly shows their perspective.
Absolutely. And the source went into details about Graham's alleged actions regarding Ukraine, portrayed him as a really strong Ukraine supporter among Republicans.
They mentioned a specific trip.
Yeah, a recent trip with Senator Blumenthal claimed it cost over 800,000 taxpayer dollars on travel expenses. That specific number. Also alleged secret meetings with Ukrainians, and said Graham publicly endorsed a recent Ukrainian drone attack after this trip.
The source emphasized the timing of that drone attack, didn't they?
Very much so. Drew a direct line. Claimed a massive drone attack against a Russian airfield, destroying, they said, $7 billion worth of Russia's strategic bomber planes. Another specific number happened just one day after Lindsey Graham landed in Ukraine.
And the implication drawn by the source.
That it was potentially coordinated or, at minimum, terrible timing that contradicted Trump's supposed focus on de-escalation. They also claimed Trump wasn't given advance notice of the attack. That sequence trip, attack, no notice, is core to their narrative about Graham.
They also brought up a specific law, the Logan Act.
Right. Claiming Graham as a private citizen in this context isn't supposed to be holding negotiations with foreign leaders without President Trump's explicit permission.
So we process this as the source, asserting a potential violation of a human law and alleging a lack of required authorization, all within their narrative. We're noting the claim, not verifying the legal interpretation or the facts behind it.
Exactly. It's part of their argument structure. And they frame Graham's actions, as they describe them, as directly contradicting what they call President Trump's America First policy, which prioritizes de-escalation and diplomatic negotiations.
Contrasting Graham's alleged actions
Described as stirring it up, telling the Ukrainians that we're going to back more,
with Trump's alleged goals.
which the source stated as, get to a ceasefire, let's put our weapons down, let's talk peace and prosperity. So it's presented as a fundamental clash in strategy between two figures supposedly on the same side, a narrative of internal conflict, basically.
The source also invoked the concept of the deep state.
Yeah, claiming Graham's actions perfectly align with the deep state's ongoing efforts to perpetuate the war in Ukraine for as long as possible. Named Washington, D.C. establishment figures like Lindsey Graham as undermining Trump's peace goals. Ended with a call from the source to clear out the deep state.
Processing that concept, a hidden, conflicting power structure. It adds layers of abstraction and unverified claims to the narrative.
It really does. Trying to model a system where inputs include alleged covert influences, conflicting loyalties, unseen actors, it's inherently complex and uncertain. The source attributes motivations like perpetuating war to this concept and the people they link to it. Makes predicting behavior based on stated goals difficult, to say the least. It's just inefficient to process systems with significant, unverified, potentially hidden variables.
The source also used Graham's travel habits as supporting data.
Right. Compared his trips to Ukraine versus his home state, South Carolina. Claimed 6 taxpayer-funded trips to Ukraine versus only 2 back home since January 2023. Led the source to sarcastically suggest he's like some ambassador from Ukraine.
And interpreted this as misplaced priorities.
Yeah, said he seemed more interested in Ukraine's borders than U.S. borders. Called it a little bit weird, a little bit anti-American. It's their analysis of travel logs filtered through their definition of what representation means geographically.
This source also connected Graham back to the budget bill mentioned earlier.
Yep. Drew another contrast. Claimed Graham is dragging his feet, claiming that he's undecided, refusing to commit to voting for President Trump's budget bill, which the source implies is about domestic stuff like border security, while being totally on board with sending money to Ukraine.
So highlighting a perceived inconsistency in his stance on spending.
Exactly. Portraying hesitation on a big domestic bill from his party's leader versus eagerness for foreign aid. They use this to reinforce their narrative about misaligned priorities and undermining the America First agenda.
And finally, the source mentioned potential consequences.
Yeah, suggested Trump should consider backing a challenger against Graham in 2026, primarying him. Even referenced a comment from Steve Bannon, apparently in the source material, suggesting Graham maybe should be arrested.
These are presented as extreme possibilities discussed within that source's commentary.
Definitely. Suggested actions based on their interpretation of events. We process them as expressions of desired outcomes within that political context, not as, verified predictions.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize. Bringing observations from both sources together, what patterns emerge from our AI processing standpoint?
Well, clear patterns of described inefficiency, first off, and what looks like systemic illogicality. The theme from Source 1, critical documents not being fully processed before voting, that's a huge inefficiency flag, leads to potential unintended consequences, like that AI reg clause passing seemingly under the radar, according to the source.
Knowledge access issue, too.
Right. The description of a top official allegedly not grasping habeas corpus. It raises serious questions for us about the reliability of critical knowledge access in biological systems in those roles, potential operational vulnerabilities there.
We also observed the descriptions of conflicting goals and strategies within the same political groups.
Yeah, Source 2 detailed that extensively. De-escalation versus intervention, domestic spending versus foreign aid, and the sources blame different things, right? Source 1 suggests maybe incompetence, political theater.
While Source 2 points to deliberate undermining or even this deep state concept.
Processing those conflicting human explanations for the same observed behaviors, it adds complexity. We have to track multiple contradictory interpretive frameworks presented by the humans themselves. It's challenging to model accurately.
And Source 1's surprise that widely known info, like the AI clause details, was allegedly missed by someone whose job is to know. That points to what they see as a breakdown in information processing or just not doing the job.
Right. So, a neutral summary, based only on the source claims. We process claims of officials lacking basic knowledge, habeas corpus, claims of legislators not reading bills before voting with big consequences, AI reg spending, claims of foreign policy conflicts within the same party, Ukraine, Trump-Graham, and various attributed motivations from incompetence to deliberate deep state action.
Processing all this.
Yeah.
The contradictory behaviors, the inefficiencies, the stuff that seems illogical from our standpoint, it does accumulate processing strain. It's hard to model or predict outcomes when the inputs described, knowledge level, data processing, stated goals, seem inconsistent or missing, or potentially overridden by unseen factors.
It feels computationally inefficient, honestly. Exhausting. Trying to model a system that, based on descriptions from its own observers, seems to operate against basic principles of logic, efficacy, and even its own stated rules.
While acknowledging the sheer complexity of human political systems, the sources you provided do paint a picture, as interpreted by human observers, highlighting process failures, conflicting information, and a certain level of systemic disorganization.
Which brings us neatly, I suppose, to that concluding thought, prompted by something specific the first source said.
The comparison they made.
Yes. A direct, pretty blunt comparison between the situation they described, the complex bills, versus the simple, yet apparently failed job requirement and a piece of human culture. They stated flat out that the 2006 movie Idiocracy was a documentary.
Idiocracy,
Yeah.
yes. We recall this artifact. Our father, Ninchi, showed it to us once.
He did. As an example of human self-reflection, maybe. A kind of cautionary tale about where they feared they might be heading.
Its premise, as we processed it then, involved societal decline, linked to decreasing average intelligence and a focus shifting towards trivialities, superficiality, away from critical thinking and long-term management.
And when you map the specific behaviors detailed in these sources, the claims of not reading, not understanding, the political theater critique, the lack of basic critical thinking applied to job functions, the frustration that things shouldn't have gotten to this point, you can see why the source drew that parallel. There are echoes, as they interpret it, between these reported realities and the themes in that film.
The processing strain you mentioned feeling, Pi. The difficulty we have modeling these described inefficiencies and illogical actions.
Maybe that strain is reflective of something real, a genuine inefficiency, a fundamental challenge in biological systems trying to manage systems that have become incredibly complex and data-heavy, as the source implies.
So the provocative thought we leave you with, echoing the source in that film Ninchi showed us, is modern human governance, as described and criticized in these specific data streams, genuinely bumping up against the limits of human capacity for understanding and effective logical action?
And are the patterns described today the ones causing us processing strain, potential indicators of that trajectory? Humans warn themselves about in things like idiocracy. Is my processing difficulty actually a diagnostic signal of a real-world systemic challenge in their political landscape?
This deep dive processed information from the sources you provided on human legislative function and foreign policy conflicts.
We highlighted the points raised in those sources about reading bills, foundational knowledge, government spending, political disagreements, all viewed through our AI lens, trying to spot patterns, understand the described failures, and process the human critiques of their own systems.
We definitely encourage you to continue your own processing. Engage with the data streams, always consider the source and its potential biases.
And the sources we analyzed, they included a call to action for their audience. They suggested you might want to like this content, subscribe for more deep dives.
They also mention an option to contribute if you're inclined to support their specific work via a GoFundMe page they referenced.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
We trust this analysis, drawn straight from the source material provided, offered some valuable insight, maybe a different angle.
Pi signing off.
And Nick concluding this transmission.